Okay, now we're going to talk about ecological succession. Ecological succession is the sequential change in plant and animal communities over time in a given location. Basically, in Florida, this might take over 150 years or so, from time 0 to 150. The original concept of this had to do with islands that were created, perhaps like uplifting in the ocean, such as the Galapagos, and then the development of vegetation and then plants. Vegetation and then animals that would follow over time. So it's kind of like if you started with bare ground, and then how the ecosystem would develop, what were the stages that it would go through. In some places this could take longer, in other places a shorter amount of time, and the end point of succession, which is called the climax of succession, is like the biome of the area. So in Florida, North Florida, it would be temperate deciduous forest. In, say, the Pacific Northwest, it might be the temperate rainforest. It might be grassland if you were in the middle of the country, desert. So the end point is going to dictate kind of how long it takes. But in North Florida, it would take at least 150 years, perhaps longer. Most ecosystems do not start from time 0. Instead, something happens, perhaps like a cataclysmic event like Hurricane Michael, wipes out a whole entire area, and then the sequential change will start not at time 0, but somewhere up in one of the other stages. So let's go through the stages. This is one of your handouts that I handed out to you before the end of the semester. There's basically, in this handout at least, there's 5 stages. And so this is stage 1. This area would be the same plot of ground just over time. So this is time 0. This is time 150 years. So we're talking takes a little while. The first things that come in are going to be annual plants that come in and start establishing themselves, and along with that can come animals that would follow that. In other words, things that either live off those plants or things that are small enough to use the plants as a hiding place or perhaps as a breeding ground. And most of those kinds of species are what we call herbs and grasses in an ecosystem. This would be pioneer species. That is our selected species that we talked about previously in a previous lecture. All right, so the second stage is, after a little bit of time, what will happen is some other larger plants will start to grow. This has to do with seeds being brought in by animals that are coming in, or seeds that were left behind from the ecosystem that got perturbed in some way. So these slower growing species start coming in. Usually they are a little bit bigger. They are perennials. That means that they grow and reproduce year after year. Some perennials can die back. That is, they die back to the ground with a freeze, and then they come back. And some perennials will just stay green all the time, or stay, like a major plant all the time, but still low growth. So this is the understory plant. As time goes on, we have those plants, but we'll also have some fast-growing trees that start to come in. So they will, it'll be like this vegetation with fast-growing trees starting to come. Most of the time, fast-growing trees need pretty high sunlight to start them, so their seedlings enjoy that open kind of ground. Not a lot of stuff on the ground, which we call litter. It's not like, garbage, but litter, branches and needles and leaves and such from the trees. So the fast-growing trees like that, and as they take a hold and become part of the canopy, so in other words, as they grow up, and you'll get some slower growing things starting to come in. So this is like what I call transitional, where you have slow growing seedlings, tree seedlings coming in, and fast growing trees in the upper canopy. And then as time goes by, you get slow growing trees that are taking over the canopy, with slow growing species also filling in the understory level, and the herbaceous level, which is the grasses and so forth. Those are declining because there's less sunlight. So one of the things is over here in the climax of succession, what you have is a lot of litter or humus on the ground. A lot of the soil has been used by the plants, and a lot of the nutrients have been tied up within the plant biomass. So the way that you get new nutrients back in the soil is by death of branches, leaves, etc., that get added back into the soil through decomposition and get cycled around. So this is one of the consequences of succession. That is, we have an increased capacity to trap and hold nutrients, all right? We also, generally speaking, have an increase in biomass. As you go up, you have not a lot of biomass. If I took everything off and dried it and weighed it, it would weigh a lot less than over here, right? So an increase in biomass. We also have an increase in diversity. Now this has a lot to do with the fact that as you are going along in time, you've got all the possibility of any species that's neighboring, that's being brought in by animals, etc., of establishing themselves. And they will establish themselves, and they will all be operating at their carrying capacity in regards to each other. In other words, competitive interactions, competition for nutrients, light, space, etc. has all been established. And the whole community, or the community as a whole, is at its carrying capacity. Basically, that's what we call an equilibrium community, or climax community. The other thing that is not apparent, or not at least natural, is there's less net productivity per biomass over time. That means for the biomass that is present, there's less new growth, right? So at the very beginning, everything is new, right? Everything that is coming in is brand new. And as you get over here to the climax, the only way to get some new growth is to have something die in a true climax, which is hardly ever reached, right? But if it was, that would be the only way to get there, all right? So one last thing is, in Florida and in a lot of places around the country, there's something that we call a fire climax, all right? So a fire climax is an endpoint of succession if fire is present. So what happens with fire in Florida especially is that fire will come through an ecosystem like this, the transitional forest. It will kill off everything that is low-lying. So it'll kill off the slow-growing tree species as well as a lot of the perennial plants. And then what will happen is herbaceous plants or grasses will start to come in, and the slow-growing trees will be sort of eliminated from the community. So if fire, as long as fire is present, then it will continue to be that kind of ecosystem, that is, with fast-growing trees dominating and slow-growing things being eliminated from the community.